I think I'll go directly to the important issues. So the question that I'm asking in this paper is a very simple one. So what accounts for political parties' positioning on anti-crisis measures? How can we explain that? And if we look at the literature and current political discourses, we can actually come up with three possible accounts, explanation. The first one is the macroeconomic principles of political parties. The second one, conflict of interest between creditors and debtors in the Eurozone. And the third one is the cleavage between opposition and cleavage. I say a few words about three possible scenarios. So the literature basically says that outcome of macroeconomic policies, fiscal and monetary policies, depends to a large extent on the economic stance of a political party. So whereas parties associated with left are more concentrated on the reduction of unemployment, and parties associated with economic rights concentrate on the reduction of inflation. That's obviously also reflected both in good and bad economic times. In macroeconomic policies, these are also the left-wing parties that are associated with Keynesian, or now neo-Keynesian macroeconomy, that briefly can be characterized by anti-cyclic measures, active role of a state, or recognition of the so-called market failures. The right-wing parties, on the other hand, are rather pursuing neoliberal policies that are pro-cyclic, introduce deregulation of the market, and are based on the general assumptions that markets act rationally. Why can we also assume that parties' positioning on anti-crisis measures are not only explained by the economic stance of parties, but also on other issues? Here, the conflict of interest between creditors and debtors. Here comes the specificity of the Eurozone in play. So, under the system of the European Financial Stability Facility and now European Stability Mechanism, there is this interdependence of states. So, debtors debtors are basically financed by guarantees granted by creditors. So if one state defaults, then creditors have to take up the responsibility for their share of debts in the European Stability of Mechanism system. And the loan that the states are granted, it's on the present. It is based on strong conditionality. And the Memorandum of Understanding, which is the tool of this austerity measures, it's related to also with a strong to loss of sovereignty. Hence, we can assume that this situation of conflicting interests, financial interests between creditors and debtors, and the resentment of creditor states can lead to a different conflict line that also accounts for political parties' positioning. Finally, the third possibility is the government-opposition cleavage. I will not talk much about it because we all know that this is the major cleavage guiding political life. Well, I have some images of Hellenization of the crisis in the public discourse. If we talk about Hellenization, this is the term that I think was coined by Paul Krugman, and he said that creditor states are predominantly explaining the crisis by irresponsible fiscal and monetary policy, fiscal policy of Southern European states. So in a way, the fact that they got into troubles, it's their fault, basically. So as you see, this is also very well pictured in the media. On the other hand, if you look at the discourse on the other side, obviously the debtor states do not buy this interpretation. They do not admit it. They do not say that a crisis is a cause of irresponsible fiscal policy. They rather point to systemic failures of the Eurozone system and stress that the austerity measures imposed on them are very unjust. Now, I'll present now, go directly to the approach of my study. It was composed in two steps. So the first one was based on the qualitative analysis, qualitative and quantitative analysis of parliamentary debates. The goal of the first step of my analysis was basically to establish how MPs position themselves with respect to crisis measures. And a source of information, I used national plenary parliamentary debates on the increased budgetary capacity of the EFSF in autumn 2011. The methods, as I said, this was a combination of qualitative and quantitative discourse analysis, and I used Atlas TI software as a research tool. Unit of the analysis was individual. So here, basically, individual statements of MPs were coded, and later on, some was on party level. In step 2, I conducted a comparative analysis. Obviously, it's not very informative for us what individual MPs have said. We are more interested to examine positions of political parties in order to say something about the Eurozone. So here I compared parties' positioning. So the unit of the analysis was no longer an individual MP, but I aggregated the data on the party level. And for conducting the comparison, I used the crisp set QCA analysis. Now, shortly in the research design, I think if you want to examine if this new conflict of interest between creditors and debtors really explains the variation in the political parties' positioning, we have to have in a sample countries that represent both states with healthy finances, the AAA states, and the bailout states as well. So from the AAA states, I had Austria, France, and Germany in my sample, mid-rating Belgium and Slovenia. Bailout likely was Spain, and bailout states Ireland and Greece. I mean, since then, this categorization is based on the Standard & Poor ranking in autumn 2011. As you know, things have changed since then, so Spain shifted to the bailout group, and Austria and France lost the AAA status. But at the point of conducting the comparative analysis, this was still the status quo. The outcome, or not speaking in terms of on QCA jargon, the dependent variable, was defined as positioning on anti-crisis measures. Conditions, or in other language, independent variables, were defined in the dichotomous way: economic orientation of a party as left-right, and that was based on the Pirodeu database, membership in a government or opposition, and absence or presence of bailouts. So here are my hypotheses. I will try to explain it in non-QCA terms. Basically, the first hypothesis explains the conditions that account for Keynesian positioning here. So we can see, in the explanation, you have the table where all the symbols are explained, but I'll do it now in a concrete hypothesis. So it's hypothesized that left-wing, absence of rights, so the left-wing positioning, presence of bailouts, and absence of government, here it's opposition membership, will lead to Keynesian positioning. On the other hand, the neoliberal positioning is conditioned on a right-wing association of a party, absence of bailout, and membership in a government. Why I came up with this hypothesis? Short explanation. To begin first with the economic orientation of the party, left-right. So as I said, we have strong evidence in the empirical literature, both in political science and in economy, that the economic stance of a party accounts very well for the macroeconomic policies that parties implement both during the crisis and in good times. So hence we can expect that if this hypothesis holds, that the findings hold true, then the left-wing parties will be still more inclined to choose Keynesian measures, and the left neoliberal. Bailout. Bailout obviously also could play a role, and this would be this a new possible account that's valid only in the Eurozone. So we can assume that parties in states where bailout is present will be willing to advocate Keynesian measures for two reasons. First of all, the societies and the voters disapprove austerity measures that generate a lot of resentment and opposition in a society. So it's very difficult for political parties to advocate them. And obviously it's much strategic for vote-seeking reasons to advocate injections of money to the market. Secondly, on a more systemic level, drawing on the recent economic research, we know that governments of states in bailout states, the risks is assessed much higher. So basically, before the crisis, they were underpriced, and during the crisis, the risk is overpriced. And that's related to the fact that investors are more afraid of a default in countries with shared currency than in countries with national currencies. And this is also visible in their credit rating. So if they increased their deficits, we can also assume that the markets would react with the panic. So the rating would decrease, and the credit rates would also increase as a consequence of that. So hence, the money, that is fiscal stimulus, would have to come from the outside, either from the EU or from other Euro member states. And we can have good reasons to assume that countries in states that have not received the bailout would be actually in favor of neoliberal anti-crisis measures. Why? Because having said that, knowing that the bailout states cannot afford to introduce fiscal stimulus, increase their deficits without having to pay, facing further difficulties to finance themselves on the markets, they would have to come up with a sort of European fiscal stimulus plan, or a new Marshall Plan that was also, these neo-Keynesian measures were also labeled like that. And this would imply that they would have to invest money in the states. That, again, would be difficult to sell to their constituencies. So hence, fighting the crisis with neoliberal measures, it's much more risky for them in financial terms. Well, the third argument, government and opposition. For opposition, it's obviously much easier to advocate policy change. I mean, the Euro member states decided to fight the crisis with neoliberal measures, hence implying them now Keynesian ones, would imply a policy change. Governments are bound by this continuity, and oppositions don't. Furthermore, there's a lot of opposition in society, so if they started advocating different policies, maybe they could also gain new voters, and in addition, they don't have to implement these policies, so this is not too risky for them. Well, and governments, obviously, they are bound by this continuity, so they would probably advocate the same policy line as they have been implementing over the year. Now, to the empirical findings on the basic level. So in my sample, I coded 44 parties. Keynesian positioning was observed in 20, neoliberal, 18, not 11, both in 5 parties and none in 11. I'll explain it shortly. Well, the reality is empirical reality is usually more complex than the QCA models. In a perfect situation, I would only have parties that either opt for Keynesian or neoliberal. This would be the perfect situation. Unfortunately, in the sample, I also had parties that were divided on the anti-crisis measures, 5 parties, and 11 parties have not positioned themselves. Exactly. For these reasons, I applied the QCA model for parties that either took a Keynesian or neoliberal stance, and I conducted a qualitative analysis to explain the positioning of the parties that had a double positioning and none. This is the summary of the QCA model, but now I'll translate it in a more general terms. So the Keynesian positioning was explained with three patterns. The first one was the dominant one. It's explained by two conditions: absence of right, so left wing, economic left, and opposition. So here we can actually say that the positioning, the choice of Keynesian anti-crisis measures was ideological. Because you see, this is 64% was the roll coverage, and 43% the unique coverage, which means that 43% of coded parties can be explained by this combination. So it's actually quite high. Why can we assume that this is economic ideology? Well, because the bailouts, actually, the variable was not necessary to account for variation. In the two second groups, you can see that the model indicated bailouts as a condition. In this first one, it's opposition, and the third one, it's economic left. On the surface, if we look just on the combination, yeah, thank you. We could think that the bailout comes very strongly into play, but we shouldn't be misled by this fact, because as I see, there are only two hard cases where we can say that bailouts clearly, not the membership in the opposition or economic left, accounts for the choice of Keynesian positioning. So here, we cannot entirely rule economic ideology out if you look at the second and the third combination. However, well, bailout is present. Now, there were two patterns that account for neoliberal positioning. So the first one is the absence of bailout, economic right, and government. The third one is absence of bailout, economic right, and absence of government. So first of all, at the first glance, we can say that institutional aspects, such as membership in the government or opposition, was not significant here. Whether if a right-wing party in a state that has not received a bailout, they would basically opt for neoliberal positioning irrespectively of the fact if they are in a government or in a opposition. However, we cannot have, this is also not a strong case for either for ideology or interest. Why is that? Well, because we have a presence of both conditions, both absence of bailout and economic rights. On the other hand, we cannot say that it was a very strong case for absence of bailout as a sufficient condition. Why? Because there was no change that, for instance, a left-wing party in a state, in a non-bailout state opted for neoliberal measures. This would be a very strong case for the absence of bailout as a condition accounting for neoliberal positioning. That was not the case, so we could not separate that. Well, now, however, if we look now at the double positioning and the no positioning, we get a better picture of what really happened. Okay, I'm almost finished. Double positioning, these were bailout states, but both government and the right-wing parties. So we can see that parties that were internally divided with respect to anti-crisis measures would opt for Keynesian measures despite the fact of being in the government and despite the fact of being representing the economic right. So here we can say that debtors' interests were clearly in play. In, well, non-positioning, the non-positioning, these were basically opposition parties in non-bailout states. We can here try to explain it with either a strategic ignorance, strategic silence or ignorance, why these parties have not positioned themselves. Maybe they were lacking the expertise, or maybe as opposition parties, they did not feel that it's so important for them to take a stance on these issues. So, on a general level, we can notice that if we look at the parliamentary, like how parliamentarians in the Eurozone debate anti-crisis measures, there is no widespread consensus on austerity as an anti-crisis approach. There is a diversity in the recommended macroeconomic policies, but there is also diversity in the logic behind these choices. So as we can see, these QCA models demonstrate that there is an evidence that both economic ideology and debtors' interests matter for their choices. However, what's really interesting here, that the presence of bailout matters, but not absence. So if we assume that, the economic ideology, economic lefts or economic rights was the initial logic, then presence of the bailouts changes the way that changes the motivations that MPs have when they advocate certain measures. So it's no longer, so their choices are no longer informed by their economic stance, but the very fact that certain states receive the bailouts. In the empirical analysis, there is no evidence that an absence of bailout has a similar effect. Left-wing opposition parties could afford to advocate measures coherent with the economic ideology. But as I said, as opposition parties, they were subject to different constraints, or rather lack of constraints that government parties were facing. And absence of bailout and economic right reinforced each other. So for these reasons, we cannot clearly say whether in case of these parties, this was more, this is a choice more based of their economic backgrounds, or rather the fact of not being a bailout states. Right, so I think like at the end of each piece of research, we should ask ourselves a question. So what do we learn from this? What is then the contribution of our findings? And the eliminated question that comes to my mind is whether the Eurozone is a special case, because we can clearly see that the mechanism that accounts for macroeconomic policy choices in the Eurozone cannot be solely explained by the economic stance of political party and the institutional aspects, whether they are in a government or opposition. And we can see that the debtors' and creditors' interests also come in play. Not in all cases, also only in debtor states, not in creditors. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Aleksandra.